I'd like to start by thanking everyone for joining us tonight. This is a completely new format for us, so we're just learning the ropes, and so we really appreciate everybody being patient, especially you, Eva. Thank you so much. So tonight, the Lethbridge Public Library is proud to host Eva Holland, the author of Nerve, A Personal Journey Through the Science of Fear. Eva is a freelance writer based in Whitehorse, Yukon. She is currently a correspondent at the magazine Outside and has had her work published in Wired, Bloomberg Business Week, Pacific Standard, National Geographic News, The Walrus, and among others. She is a former associate editor and contributing editor at Up Here, an award-winning magazine focused on Canadian North, and a founding contributor to Vela, an online magazine of creative nonfiction. In 2015, Eva was a finalist for the Canadian National Magazine Award. Tonight, she will be discussing her book, Nerve, whose topic, fear, would be considered timely by many at this time. And so thank you, Eva, for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me virtually. I really appreciate it.
It'd be nice to be in person, but, you know, times have changed.
Yeah, best laid plans and all that.
So basically tonight, we have some questions that we prepared, but if anybody has any questions that they want to ask, feel free to pop them in the chat, and my coworker Jonathan, who is just in the background, will send them to me, and then I can ask Eva them as well along the way. So I guess just to start off, there may be some people that are listening that haven't read the book. So could you maybe describe to them how you came about it, or what it was for you, and just maybe give some background for it?
Sure. So Nerve is sort of a hybrid. It's part memoir and part science journalism. And so it follows the story of how I decided to see if I could sort of face my fears or overcome them or renegotiate them, whatever that looked like. I wanted to sort of confront my fears and see if I could change my relationship to them. And so that's sort of the narrative thread, is that personal storyline. And then woven throughout the narrative is a look at the science of fear, how it works in our minds and our bodies, why we have it and why it matters, and some of the treatments that we have as well for sort of excessive or irrational fear, like phobias or trauma and anxiety, that sort of thing.
So one of the things that's really stood out to me was the fact that you sort of balanced it as a personal narrative, but also included sort of this science background behind it. What was your reasoning for that, or why did you choose to write it that way as opposed to just doing as a personal narrative?
It was really about what I was interested in spending my time with, I guess. I didn't want to just do a personal narrative because I really wanted for myself to understand the mechanics of this stuff, and not just the how, but also the why. I wanted to know the answers to these questions that I had about the science. And so if I was going to figure out those answers myself, it made sense to put them in the book. And then I didn't want to do just a pure science book either, because that didn't seem honest about where I was coming from and why I was interested in these questions. And so it felt important to me to have both halves in there. But I knew that balancing the two would probably be tricky. So maybe the trickiest sort of part of the project was trying to make those two halves fit together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I found that it was a good flow between them, and it kind of brought everything together. Yeah.
That's good to hear. Thank you.
So how did you approach making the science of fear accessible to a wide, background of people who might not, have sort of a scientific background? Is that why maybe you chose to add the personal narrative part as part of the book as well?
I think that was part of it, yeah, is I knew that there'd be a different audience if it was a hybrid than if it was a pure science book. I also don't have a strong science background myself. And so I was really learning this stuff as I went along, even some of the really classic case studies I might have heard of but wasn't familiar with at best, and so I think that probably helps to make it accessible to a general audience, is that I was a member of that audience and sort of standing in for the reader, hopefully, as I figured this stuff out and tried to express it in the clearest terms and analogies that I could come up with. And I found that always having that personal experience to fall back on to explain, when I would read a scientific concept, I would recognize it from my own experiences and be like, oh yeah, that's sort of happened to me, or I relate to that. And then I would try to tie the two together, and hopefully that helps to make it accessible to readers.
So like when you set about writing this, did you start off with sort of your personal stories, or did you start off with doing sort of the research of fear, and then that's how you kind of brought you to writing it?
I started out, the idea to write the book started with the personal storyline. And then also when I was literally writing the book, I wrote the personal parts first. Most of the time I was writing the personal sections while I was researching the science sections. And then I would come along behind and write the science section. Sometimes of the same, because it switches back and forth between chapters. So I really didn't write it in a linear way. I wrote it like in a given chapter, I might write the personal scenes and leave empty blocks for like the now explain the science here. And then meanwhile, I'd be doing interviews and reading journal articles and stuff, and then come back and fill those pieces in, and then try to make it read seamlessly and not like I wrote it in weird chunks.
Definitely, it was seamless. Don't worry, it was good. So what was the most difficult aspect of writing about fear, do you think? Was it a fear itself?
The terrible irony of being terrified of writing my book about fear. Yeah, no, that was part of it. Was, it's my first book, and I got this contract to do it. For people that don't know, for fiction, typically you would write the whole novel first if you're a first timer, and for nonfiction you can sell it on what's called on proposal. So I submitted a proposal, and then I had to actually write the book, and that was terrifying. I was like, oh, now I've signed a contract and I have to produce this, and it better be okay. So that was scary, but there were two things that really scared me. One was it was scary to write some of the personal stuff in terms of the writing, and then the research parts that scared me were like the most intense, like neuroscience, trying to get a grasp on that, and feeling really like I was a little out of my depth sometimes, and being scared that I would get it all horribly wrong and be a laughingstock, or the way your brain. Mm-hmm. The way your brain goes into disaster zone.
Yeah. All the what ifs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Let's see. So you obviously describe the loss of your mother in this book. And it's something sort of we were talking about at the beginning of this. But why do you think, in particular, like the loss of a parent, why for so many of us do you think that is our greatest fear? Or one of our greatest fears?
That's a good question. So for folks who haven't read the book yet or picked it up yet, my mom's death from a stroke really suddenly in 2015 was sort of the inciting incident of the book, because I had always been so afraid of her dying. And when she did die, I was very upset. And after several months of acute grief, I kind of came through the worst of it and was like, oh, I'm sad, but I'm going to be okay. This hasn't, ruined my life or ended my life as I know it. And so that was what drove me to think, well, maybe I can face some of my other strongest fears now too. So yeah, why do we fear the loss of a parent so much? I think there's such an anchor. I mean, for many of us, they're just such an anchor in the world. Not for everyone. I was lucky to have a really great relationship with my mom when she was alive, but, they are how we know the world, particularly when we're small. They're our introduction to almost everything. And then for many of us, they're the people that we circle back to for reassurance or advice, and they just orient us in space, So losing that kind of anchor is really terrifying on a really deep level for a lot of people, I think. Even if we don't necessarily think about it consciously, it's a deep-seated thing.
Yeah. I definitely, that's how I feel it. It's just this like overhanging thing, and I guess you just don't ever want to face that fear as constant. So it's, but I do think it is tied to the relationship that we have with our parents for sure.
And another hard thing about it, is that, my mom died 20 years sooner than I expected her to, but we all know that unless something goes really wrong, we will probably have to experience our parents' deaths, unless we die first, which is not ideal either. It's sort of this inevitability that if life goes as expected, you will lose your parents. Yeah. And that's a hard thing to just sort of have hanging over you.
Yeah. I think it's really brave of you, though, to tackle it and trying to overcome that sadness, because I know, like, from my own father who lost his mother when she was 55, that sadness is still very much with them because, you know, it was sudden as well.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it's something very brave, I think, for sure.
Interesting.
So something else that, you know, really touched me when I was reading it. So what made you resist the use of avoidance in dealing with your fears to take the harder route? Like what drove that, or what really made you to do that?
For me, it was a calculus of what am I giving up or what am I losing? Because, yeah, I'm afraid of heights, and that's avoidable, right? Particularly the very precise type of fear of heights that I experience, which is a fear of sort of exposed slopes or dangling. Like I'm okay in elevators or on bridges, in airplanes, but it was the sense that if I could fall. And so those are situations I could avoid, but living in the Yukon the way I do and being involved with mountain sports, both professionally and personally, you know, I would have had to give up work opportunities. I would have had to give up social opportunities. You know, this is what my friends do. They play outside in the mountains. And to avoid all of that, to avoid being scared, would have been closing myself off from a lot of good things. And so if it was something I could have avoided really easily, maybe that's what I would have done, but it felt like I was giving up too much and closing myself off from too much. And so it seemed necessary to try to do something about it, even though confronting your fears that way is also hard.
Yeah. Well, one of the things like I remember in particular is like you wrote that, or I think it was a quote from somebody, but it sort of pertained to what you were sort of in dealing with your fears, was the fact that once you sort of overcome one of your fears, like more of you comes out. And like I really, like that struck me. It's true. Like once it, you know, that can kind of, that part of you can sort of push to the side. But do you think that once we overcome fears, that we just replace them with new ones, or what do you think?
It seems that way sometimes, doesn't it? It does. I don't think it has to be that way. I think if in the process of overcoming the initial fears, you learn better ways to manage your fear and to understand your fear, then I think even if new things come along, you can sort of coexist better with them. Because yeah, it does, when your fear is controlling you, it feels like it's sort of hemming you in and making your life smaller and making your dreams smaller or your personality smaller, whatever the case may be, depending on what's going on, you know.
Yeah.
It felt very confining to me. And so I think if you can find a better way to live with fear, then even if you feel like you're just substituting new ones for old ones, maybe you can make them less confining as you sort of learn to manage those feelings.
Yeah, well, that's a great perspective on it. I didn't think about that. So you, in the book, you describe different types of fear. Could you maybe like touch on how they are different for maybe people who haven't read it yet, but like different levels of fear?
Sure. So I sort of follow three main threads in the book. The first is phobias, which, I mean, are an exaggeration, but I sort of think of them as sort of simple fear, classic fear. You know, you're scared of a shark, you react. That's like a pretty pure sort of stimulus and response kind of a thing. And then there's trauma, which is sort of fear based on memories, is sort of the simplest way to look at it. It's fear of the past coming back to bite us again in the present and worrying about the future. And then the third thread that I follow in the book is sort of the unnameable existential fears we have of death and loss and sort of dread, that kind of thing. I don't get deeply into anxiety in the book. Anxiety is also a part of this whole collection. All of these things are way more closely related than we always understand. You know, phobias, anxiety disorders, PTSD, and then the less, you know, the less clinical versions of those things in our daily lives, you know, that don't necessarily require treatment, but are just, you know, dread, anxiety, fear. They're all really closely related. I didn't go deeply into anxiety, in part because it's not something that before the pandemic, I would have said it's not something I really experienced in my day-to-day life. That is changing. But But also because there's a lot of really good books on anxiety out there, and so it felt like that ground had been well covered recently by some other new books. So the three main threads I follow in the book are sort of like phobia, trauma, and dread, for lack of a better term.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you also discuss in detail taking a pill to conquer your fear of heights. How did it allow you to overcome much of your fear of dangling? Has it continued to work? Have you tried climbing since writing the book?
Yeah, so I did this experimental drug treatment for phobias in Amsterdam. That was one of the last things I did for the book, and it was wild. It is a combination of the therapy and the pill. So it's a beta blocker called propranolol that some people might have heard of. It's a common blood pressure medication. People take it for stage fright. And under ordinary circumstances, it just sort of slows your engine down a little bit. But this clinician in Amsterdam is combining it with a phobia treatment. So what she does is she triggers your phobia to as strongly as she safely can. They told me they needed to get me to sort of like an 80 to 90 out of 100. And then she gives you this pill, and what neuroscientists now understand is that there's a protein synthesis reaction involved in our brains, not only when we form long-term memories for the first time, when we sort of put them in storage, but also when we pull them out of storage and then put them back again. There's a protein synthesis mechanism that occurs. And beta blockers disrupt protein synthesis. And research initially in rats had shown that beta blockers were disrupting memory formation, which sounds creepy and sort of sci-fi, but she doesn't erase your memories. She just sort of alters your relationship to them, which still sounds creepy. But so you get your fear triggered, and then you take this pill, and it's like the disruption to the protein synthesis severs the connection between your fear in the moment and your memories of your past panic attacks or whatever the case may be. And then so then it's like, because these reactions that we have are like a pattern that our mind forms, and then the more you do it, the easier it is to go down that sort of chain reaction again. So she severs that connection, and then the next time you're exposed to the source of your fear, you can still remember all your previous panics, but it's like the link has been broken and you don't react anymore when it works.
Yeah.
So it did work for me. She put me, I didn't know how she was going to trigger me in Amsterdam. It's like the flattest place on the planet. But she put me in the bucket of a fire truck, like a ladder truck, and sent it up as high as it would go. And it was, not pleasant. It was terrifying. And then the next day, after taking the pill and a 24-hour rest, I went back up and I was completely fine. I was taking selfies. I was laughing and smiling. It was like the day before I could barely stand in the bucket. I was, she wouldn't let me hold on to anything to try to feel safer. So I was just kind of swaying there.
Wow.
Yeah, it was amazing. And I haven't tested it extensively yet. I haven't gone rock climbing, which is one of the things I do in the book to try to learn to control my fear of heights. Mm-hmm. But I have gone ziplining and was totally fine.
Oh, awesome.
And I also did some pretty steep exposed hiking last summer, and I sort of expected to be, on my hands and knees sobbing. And I felt cautious, but I didn't freak out. And it was, a place where caution was warranted. It was sort of steep and exposed. So that's the other piece of it, right, is learning to trust yourself again, because some fear is very rational and necessary.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. I wondered how you were affected by it after. So that's interesting. Do you think like going forward, it's like, I don't know. I don't know about like the actual, I guess the doctor you went to see, but is it something that you just like continue yourself with like, and then hope?
It's supposed to be a one-time treatment. And it's fairly new, so we don't know, she hasn't been doing it long enough to know if it lasts 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. But in theory, it's supposed to be a permanent change. So we'll see. Hopefully that endures. I would certainly hope that it's permanent for me.
Interesting. So how do people know when to listen to their fear and when to suppress or ignore it, do you think?
It's a really hard thing to figure out. It's still work in progress for me. I had spent so much time feeling like my fears were overblown and irrational and like I had too much fear when I should be fine, that it's then a hard thing to say, okay, but when should I listen? Like I was saying, it's hard to learn to trust those instincts again. So, but we do need to trust those instincts sometimes, because fear is a survival mechanism. And I have a new appreciation for it now, having worked on the book. I think it's maybe a lifelong process of figuring out when to listen and when to ignore it. It's one of those things that we keep having to learn over and over again, I think.
It's interesting. Like I definitely think what I took from it was, if it's something that's limiting you so much, that fear that's something that you should try to, overcome so that you can kind of live your life in, not necessarily like it needs to, but just to make it more well-rounded, and so that you don't have that and you can kind of, achieve what you want to achieve. Like I was telling you at the beginning, I told my mom as well, she has an extreme fear of heights as well, to the point where we were in Paris going up the Eiffel Tower and she refused to get off the elevator that takes you up to it. Yeah. Like was holding onto a pole and refused to let go of it. And I told her about this and I was like, see mom, like it's holding you back. You never got to experience it. I went by myself. Yeah,
I've been there.
Yeah, exactly.
That was something that I did feel by the end of the book. Like when I looked back, it felt like the fears that I ultimately ended up wanting to learn to ignore were the ones that sort of locked me in place. Mm-hmm. And the ones that sort of drove me to action were the ones to listen to. Like if you're standing on the sidewalk and you see a kid run into the street in traffic, like your instinct is going to be to move. Yeah. And that's the fear that you listen to, is like run and grab that kid. Mm-hmm. Right. But the fears that confused me and froze me in place ended up being more the ones that I felt able to try to discard. That was the closest I came to a guideline, but it's hard. It's a hard thing to learn to listen to our reactions and make split-second decisions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so many people are gripped by fear right now and dealing with obviously the pandemic, and so much of it being unknown, and we don't know what's going to happen. So how have you, I guess, been dealing with that fear of the unknown, and how do you think other people could be dealing with it too?
Yeah, my coping mechanisms have been varied, I guess. It's been a little up and down over here. There's times when I feel pretty overwhelmed, and I think the first step is to say, okay, I'm overwhelmed right now. That's okay. That's natural. That's natural anytime, it's okay to be overwhelmed by stress and anxiety and fear, but particularly now. And so maybe I'm going to step away from the news and take a walk with the dog, or maybe I'm going to get up and bake something, or, I think, step one is we're so hard on ourselves. We're so hard on ourselves about this stuff. I think step one is to just be like, okay, maybe today is an anxiety day and I have to step away from the laptop, or, man, I really didn't sleep last night, so I'm going to set my alarm an hour later. Just trying to go easy on ourselves, and then figuring out what helps, what calms you down. I did something I've never done before at the start of all this, just before the lockdown. When it was clear it was coming, I went to the bookstore here and I bought an adult coloring book and pencil crayons. I haven't used pencil crayons since I was like 14. And it's an adult coloring book that's like all swear words.
Yes, I have that as well. Yeah.
And I just like, when I would get, I'd be scrolling Facebook, and especially in the early days when there was just so much bad news and nobody knew what was going to happen. Like, is it going to be like Italy here? Is it going to be like New York? And I would just, when I started to feel that my heart start to race, and I would just get up and go over to the coffee table, and I had the coloring book open, and the pencil crayons were pre-sharpened, which is amazing.
Nice. Yeah.
I don't think that existed when I was a kid. And I would just start coloring, and something about, I don't know, I guess it's something about the sort of repetitive, mindless action calm me down. I have lots of friends who've gotten into meditation apps or yoga apps. Walks are great. Figuring out what works to sort of slow your system down when you can feel it sort of overheating is really important. And then, if you're really in distress, it's a hard time, of course, because we can't go, hug a friend or it's not that easy to like see a therapist right now, that kind of thing. But reaching out by phone, whether that's to a professional or just to a friend or family member, is really important. Maybe the most important thing is just to like feel those connections.
Yeah. Do you think it's harder because it is so unknown to have to deal with that fear?
Yeah. If we all knew exactly what was going to happen, even if it was really bad, you could start to make a plan, deal with it, right? Yeah. We're built for action. That's what our fear system does. We talk about a fight or flight response, and that language is like a little bit outdated now as they understand more about how the system actually works. But this is how we experience it, and it's a drive to act, to respond to the threat. And what's so hard about this is that, one, the best response is to stay home and do nothing, and two, there's so much unknown, and so it's really hard. We want to know what we're dealing with so we can plan how to get through it. And sitting and waiting is a really hard thing to do in the face of a threat.
Exactly. So in the book, you write about that fear is an experience that unites us all. So even as in the moment, it makes each of us feel alone. Does the fact that many people are simultaneously confronting a collective fear offer a way of dealing with the fear itself? Like as a group? It's interesting.
Oh, yeah, I think so. I hope so. We often feel so alone in this stuff. And one thing that releasing the book has taught me is how untrue that is. I have heard from so many people who had experiences so similar to mine, or a loved one had experiences similar to mine, like we talked about before we started. You think that we all think that our lives are so original, but so many other people have found themselves exactly in our shoes at other times and places, and so the fact that this is all out in the open and that we're all dealing with this uncertainty and fear together, I think is helpful. It's a helpful thing to remind yourself of. And on a practical level, I think it's helpful in terms of cutting through some of the silence and some of the stigma around issues like fear and trauma and anxiety. It's if we can be more open about this stuff, I think that can help people cope with it and seek help when they need to. And so maybe something like this pandemic will help reduce that stigma and increase openness.
Yeah. But I think like for me, like just having like something like your book and having, that conversation be open and at least it's trying to get it out there that it's okay to have those fears and it's okay to talk about them and it's okay to be honest about them. And that's the best way of dealing with it. And I hope people, in coming out of this, I've, reading that a lot of the government money is going to go towards mental health because they're quite fearful of what, this society will look like after, the pandemic because, people are so isolated and without loved ones and, having to sort of live at home by themselves or with, one other person. So it's very isolating. So I agree. I think having, those conversations and just people being, talking about it open and honestly is probably the best thing, right?
I hope so. Yeah. And I know that, having this stuff being kind of semi-secret only makes it worse. The times that I was embarrassed to be afraid in front of people and tried to sort of like squish it down only made things worse in the moment. It never helped. So I hope that, it would be great if there were some resources put into mental health supports during and after all of this. I think people are going to need it. I mean, we already needed it, but we'll need it more now.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because it's such a large amount of people all dealing with, something so similar all at once. And it'll just be very interesting because once we come out of it, how it will look and how it might change people's attitudes as well.
Mm-hmm. definitely. Yeah, it's interesting to try to sort of picture like, what am I gonna be like after all this? My grandmother lived through the Depression, and she always had a huge pantry full of canned goods and saved
Yeah.
every coupon she ever saw in her entire life. And maybe I'm never gonna be without rice and beans in my cupboard again for the rest of my life. Who knows?
We'll definitely be buying more yeast. Jeez, didn't know that one was gonna go.
Yeah, yeast and puzzles, jigsaw puzzles are a hot ticket item.
I know. Or wipes. I finally found them 2 months later. When talking about the various car crashes you've been involved in, you mentioned that society relies on blind trust that everyone follow the system. Sadly, in many cases, our personal lives, and in many cases in our personal lives and on the news, people aren't always like following protocols designed to keep us safe during this pandemic. So how do you think we deal with the fear resulting from this broken trust?
It's a hard one. And I think it goes back to what we were saying about what the fallout from this will be. I mean, it might be a reduction. It might be for some of us a reduction in trust in others. So the context for that quote from the book was, I was hit by a U-Haul truck that came across the center line on a 2-lane highway. So he was oncoming, and he was looking out the window at the scenery, and he just, when the road curves, and he just didn't curve with it, he just plowed straight ahead into my lane, and I was able to get out of the way enough to avoid a head-on collision, barely, but it was a full side swipe, and the car was a write-off, and I was okay, but after that, I was sort of paranoid that people wouldn't stay in their lane. And yeah, there's a lot of, I think the cars on a highway involve a lot of trust in each other. And that is sort of how society operates in a lot of ways at large, is we trust each other to like more or less do the right thing most of the time. So yeah, some of that trust will have to be earned back probably. And some people might be, for instance, wiping things down with wipes for the rest of their lives. Hopefully, if they're finding that to be a really anxiety-inducing thing, they can find some relief from that eventually. But there may also just be new habits that won't necessarily be tied up in fear and anxiety. We might just not shake hands anymore, and I guess that would be okay. As long as we still find other ways to greet each other and show sort of, polite affection for whatever else a handshake represents.
Yeah, it's because that was something that when I was reading it, I know when I was in a car accident for a while, it took me to, I was always afraid of people bowing into the back of me. That was always my fear for a very long time. And, now I can see it in, the grocery store, the attitudes are, people are so fearful of others, and, the anger that comes out of it as well. I find that part really interesting. How that's the reaction that people are having towards, people not following the rules or, coming into their personal space. It's the anger that comes out of it.
Yeah, fear and anger are so tied together. And that's often, I think, part of why people view fear as a bad thing, because it can lead to anger. But I think part of learning to sort of manage our fear is not letting it just sort of pull the engine cord and fire up our anger machine, if that's not too tortured of an analogy. Fear is important for survival, but it doesn't have to lead us into sort of furious anger. But that is one of our response to a threat, right? Fight.
Yeah. I just find it's very interesting that seems to be the prevailing sort of response right now. I'm assuming it's because so much of it is tied to our own personal safety and the fact that, nobody wants to get sick, and so that's reliant on how others behave in, like around you when you can't just be at home.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't like to be so dependent on others in such a really upfront way for our safety. And people feel helpless and scared, and so they lash out.
Yeah. So in the final chapter of the book, you briefly discuss how sometimes we lack control over events in our lives. What role do you feel that lack of control plays in our fears?
It depends on the individual. For me, it was a big part of the puzzle, I think. I'm a little bit of a control freak, and feeling like I was out of control was a big part of my fear reactions. Feeling like I could fall on the side of a mountain, feeling like I could, lose my grip, lose traction. But we can't always. The solution isn't to figure out how to control everything. The solution is to figure out a better acceptance of the fact that we can't always control everything. I think sometimes that's what we see as a solution is, well, I feel like I'm losing control of this situation. I better, get a better grip on things. But that's not really a productive way forward. That's what the avoidance stuff can come back to as well, is trying to control the variables in your life. But that can quickly spin out of control. Like the woman in the book who was afraid of mice, that might have been fine if she only reacted when she actually saw a mouse. But she was afraid of mice all the time and constantly trying to control her circumstances by doing stuff like making noise to scare the mice away, and wearing boots in the middle of the night in the dark so she wouldn't step on a mouse, but then also keeping like fabric covering the tops of the boots so the mice couldn't get into the boots. And it's sort of this spiraling effort to control the situation. And it was never enough.
Yeah, it kind of traps you in that fear, and it just grows and grows and grows. Yeah. So you underwent different treatments for your fears. Do you think that sometimes people can go too far in trying to overcome those fears? Do you think there's a line where, it's too much or it's taking it a bit too far?
Yeah, I might have come pretty close to that line myself a couple times. I'm not sure that going skydiving was the best option for me to try to cure my fear of heights. I was lucky I didn't do myself or anyone else any harm in pushing myself pretty hard a couple times. In general, I don't think people who are feeling inhibited by fear, there's not much risk of them going too far because it's so hard to push past where you are. Somebody asked me if I'm now sort of like too unafraid, like too much of a risk taker. And I don't feel that way at all. I still feel like a cautious driver, even though I'm not scared of driving anymore. I'm still cautious around exposed heights. I haven't become, a huge adrenaline junkie, because I'm no longer as inhibited as I was. I think, I don't think it's a huge concern. It can happen, certainly. We can push ourselves too hard. And there's a reason why these processes are supposed to be sort of incremental, and rather than sort of all in, go big or go home.
Yeah. No, I think there's like, you have to regulate your own sort of level of what to you is still comfortable, I guess, right? Like you obviously want to overcome that fear, but at the same time, you got to know what you're okay with as well too, right?
Yeah. And always going back and looking at that calculation again of like, is facing this fear, it's hard to face this fear, is what I'm getting back in terms of whatever it's sort of, what you're trying to, how do I say this? So going back to what we were talking about with, the things that I would have given up being too much, you have to keep checking in with yourself and say, is this still too much? Or would I rather, you don't have to keep pushing yourself indefinitely. You can reach a point where you're like, okay, I've done enough. Now maybe I've found a happy medium.
Were you ever just like standing there, just like afraid, like in tears so much that you were like, no, I can't, like I just can't? Did you, and then sort of overcome that? Like, did you ever get to that point where you're just like, no, I can't, I just can't?
I'll give you an example. I took a whitewater kayaking course a couple years ago, and I was supposed to run this rapid with the instructor in the boat right ahead of me. And then something happened involving one of the other students, and she had to go deal with that. And she ended up being like, just go by yourself. And I had thought I was going to follow her. And I just said, no, I don't want to go by myself. I'm not ready for that. I don't feel ready to do this by myself. And she kept trying to talk me into it. And she said, are you going to feel bad later if you don't try this? You know? And I said, no, I'm not. I'm not going to go home and call myself a coward and beat myself up. Like, I'm not ready to do this, and I don't want to do it. And I didn't feel bad later. So I think that we can know when we reach our limits.
Yeah. I think like that's one thing that like for me I always find is tricky, is like, when do I know to push myself because I want to overcome that fear, and when do I know it's something that I won't like necessarily regret not doing, or, you know, trying because it's just, you know, or how much of it is peer pressure because someone tells you like, just do it, right? Like to them, it's not a fear, but to you, it genuinely is. And so like, how do you balance that, right? Like, even as an adult, there's so much peer pressure to do it because you see all your friends, you know, going down a water slide and they're like, just do it. Like, you know, like, I'm not scared. Why are you so scared? But, you know, how do you balance that? And how do you, I guess, like how do you have that rational conversation in your mind and in that moment too, I guess?
Yeah, there's so much to untangle. You know, fear of regret is a big one. Am I going to regret not doing this? Am I going to regret doing it? And then, you know, the fear that we talk about a lot, FOMO, right? Fear of missing out. Yeah, I know it's hard to untangle this stuff. And I still work on it, you know. Well, right now, somebody was joking the other day, there's no FOMO right now because there's nothing to miss out on. And it's true.
A sad reality. Do you think that you'll write more to this as, you know, sort of your story progresses, or do you have like another idea of what something you want to write about in the future?
I don't know if I'll write more about my personal relationship to fear, maybe like kind of an essay that's sort of a second epilogue someday if I have more to say, but I'm definitely interested in learning more about the science side that I got into in the book. Really interested in kind of the intersection of like mental health and medicine and neuroscience, what we're learning about the brain. It's all of that stuff is really interesting to me, and there were so many rabbit holes that I couldn't fully go down for the scope of this book. So there's lots more for me to dig into there, hopefully.
So we had a question from somebody. So the question is, up until recently, there's been a stigma against discussing sort of any mental health or, you know, being afraid of things. Do you think this prevents people of a certain age from dealing with their fears?
Yeah, and not just of a certain age, although I'm sure that generational stuff plays into it too. You know, it can depend on your family environment and maybe the community that you live in, or just your own mentality of like, I'm not the kind of person who asks for help, for instance. You know, I wasn't somebody who felt comfortable asking for help for years, so I just didn't. But definitely, it can be generational as well, and I think it can be really hard to get back past some of those barriers and get past that stigma and say, you know, I'm not okay. Can somebody help?
Yeah, it's you know, it's nice that it's like come out, you know, recently as more of a discussion and more an open thing. But I always wondered that as well, like, you know, people being that in itself being a fear of, you know, having that conversation with somebody, because, you know, you're opening yourself up and you're having that honest conversation with somebody and saying, you know, I'm not okay, and, you know, these are the reasons why.
And the stigma, you know, it's not imaginary. It's not just in your head. Like there There are places where you would have to worry about what your boss would think, or, it's not just about putting it on the individual to like get to the point where they feel okay with this stuff. It's also about fixing aspects of our society to make it okay to say, I am having panic attack,
Yeah. Were you afraid to like have your story like out there for maybe like people in your life, or even now as you're meeting more people, like, now people know your story, like, was that ever a fear for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm self-employed, so that's one thing I don't have to worry about. But yeah, I was self-conscious about some of the stuff in the book for sure. I had like this recurring vision of the section about car accidents of like my insurance company calling me or something and being like, "You've had a lot of car accidents." So yeah, I felt self-conscious about some of it for sure, but it's also been kind of cool to have it out there and just be like, yeah, this is, and now people in my life know. Some of my close friends didn't know some of this stuff, and they're like, oh wow, it's funny to read your book and piece it together that that's what you were dealing with at that point in time, and I had no idea.
Yeah. Well, I think like I always find when I tell people more about my story, or I'm more honest about the fact, that I deal with anxiety, it's very interesting sort of the conversations that you have with people after that as well, right? Like people are, I find more and more people are willing to have, like, to tell you their own story, and it's just very interesting. The dynamic of the relationship changes.
Way more often than you think. They say, me too.
Yeah, you must get that, because we were sort of talking at the beginning about how there's like intersections of how my own, family and really was similar to the story you were telling. Like, I'm sure you've done a lot of conversations with people, and even when you're writing it, did you have a lot of that, like where people were like, oh my God, my story is the exact same? Or
Yeah, it was really heartening while I was working on the book to, go to a party and remember those. And tell people what I was working on, and they would be like, oh man, I've always been so afraid of whatever the case was. And I was like, oh good, there's going to be people that want to read what I'm writing, because there's a lot of people that can relate. It was sort of heartening. And then since the book's come out, I've gotten emails from people who've had sort of eerily similar experiences. I did an interview with a guy in Hamilton, Ontario, I think, who was like, had the identical experience to me in the same cathedral in Florence.
Wow.
Panicking on the balcony. It was, we share so much more with other people than we realize.
Yeah. I think it's really special part of it is the fact that you were able to share your experience.
Thanks.
Yeah. So I think that's it for what we have tonight. If anybody else has any questions, they can quickly pop them in. If you're interested in purchasing Eva's book, there is a link on our main page to where you can buy it. And then, as always, the library has copies too for you to borrow. But we really appreciate Eva being here with us tonight in this weird circumstance.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me and for doing these events, even in these strange times. And I wish I could have been there in person like we planned, but maybe later, huh?
Yeah, for sure. And anytime you write anything, I really enjoyed this. So I'm sure other people, want to hear more of your stories.
Thanks.
Thanks everybody for coming tonight, and Jonathan popped the link in the chat if you want to follow it there as well to buy the book. If somebody else has any other questions, well, thank everybody for coming, and especially Eva.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good night.
Thanks.